Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez this week to talk about the threat to abortion rights, Kevin McCarthy in the Republican House, her fight to address the climate crisis, and her thoughts on a Biden re-election campaign. News just broke this week that President Biden is preparing to enter the 2024 presidential race as soon as maybe next week. Your politics are clearly to the left of his, but you've worked with him on a range of issues. Where has he exceeded your expectations, and where has he disappointed you?
You know, I think President Biden has very much exceeded my expectations in terms of investment in public infrastructure, in what we did with the American Rescue Plan, in really pushing, and I believe that if we were able to get items like minimum wage past the Senate, I do believe that he would have signed those as well. I think when it comes to issues around immigration and in our criminal legal system, we have a long ways to go.
What political advice would you give to him? And I ask you because when he's running, he has to build a coalition. He also has to appeal to a huge population that you very much appeal to. So what advice would you give to him?
I think that we are in a really important moment where the landscape of American politics is shifting, and the communities that have historically been almost the center of the political universe, suburbs and very, certain affluent communities, while are still very important part of the political constellation that is this country, young people are entering and engaging in a way that has become a very real political force. It is a political force that the Republican
Party underestimated.
That is underestimated, but not underestimated by the Republican Party. They're already discussing how to engage in disenfranchisement towards young people, in addition to the disenfranchisement that they impose on communities of color. And so my advice would be that while this balancing act is difficult, it is not something to be taken for granted. And when we fight for the priorities of young people and in a multi-class, multiracial coalition, they will come out and fight for us.
Since the Supreme Court overturned Roe, Republican state legislatures have moved to roll back abortion access, with 15 states so far passing near total bans. Now access to the abortion drug mifepristone has also been challenged. It seems pretty clear that the fight for abortion access did not end with Roe, and opponents of abortion access are still at it very much. How bad do you think this could get for reproductive rights in the United States?
I think we're in an extremely serious moment. I believe that the Republican Party is not starting at Roe. They will not stop at Roe. They will not stop just at women's rights. I believe that what we are seeing is a concerted rollback of civil liberties in general. Our right to privacy, our right to bodily autonomy, our right to marry whomever we wish to marry. All of this is at risk. I do not think they will stop. And many of the folks, there were so many people when we were warning that Roe was truly at risk, called progressives hysterical. And they said that we were overestimating the risk, that this is never going to happen. And just as we warned about Roe, we are warning about the very real risks, and we're already seeing the attacks on trans Americans. We are seeing the attacks on LGBT Americans. We have even seen Republican members of the Senate insinuate that interracial marriage is something that should be up for debate. These are our civil rights and our civil liberties, and we have to resist. We must resist these attempts to roll back the basic human rights of certain communities of Americans based on identity.
This week, Fox News settled their defamation lawsuit with Dominion Voting Systems for $787.5 million, a lot of money. It's now one of the largest media defamation settlements in history. Do you think in making this settlement, Dominion's lawyers made a mistake in not requiring Fox acknowledge on air that it lied to its viewers?
Well, this was a corporation suing another corporation for material damages. Their job is to go in and get the most money that they can. And I think that they did that. They are not lawyers for the American public. And I think what is best for the country what would have been best for the country would have been to demand that and to not settle until we got that. But that is not their role. And so for us, I think this really raises much larger questions. Very often, I believe that we leave to the courts to solve issues that politics is really supposed to solve, that our legislating is supposed to solve. We have very real issues with what is permissible on air, and we saw that with January 6th. Mm-hmm. And we saw that in the lead up to January 6th, and how we navigate questions not just of freedom of speech, but also accountability for incitement of violence. This is the line that we have to really explore through law as well. And
do you think media organizations or social media platforms should be accountable for the role for being platforms for incitement?
I believe that when it comes to broadcast television, like Fox News, these are subject to federal law, federal regulation in terms of what's allowed on air and what isn't. And when you look at what Tucker Carlson and some of these other folks on Fox do, it is very, very clearly incitement of violence. Very clearly incitement of violence. And that is the line that I think we have to be willing to contend with.
Jim Jordan, your friend and mine, has really been working overtime to make the argument that New York City is unsafe. This is your home, where you represent. My mother grew up here. On Monday, Jordan had the House Judiciary Committee hold a field hearing in Manhattan in order to attack Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. I mean, part of his ongoing attacks on him, I think it's fair to say, arguing that his policies and focus on indicting Trump has led to more crime. What's your response to Jordan and this argument?
Well, first and foremost, it is a complete abuse of power for Jim Jordan to lead a federal congressional hearing into municipal decisions. And the reason he is abusing his power is because he has decided that his main job is to defend one individual, which is former President Trump, and not to represent his constituents or his district. Every municipality has the right to govern as they see fit, and it is not the federal government's responsibility to go in and micromanage individual prosecutors on a municipal level. That being said, his claims around safety, while every city has their challenges, what we are seeing, the cities that Jim Jordan represents have far higher incidents of violence than New York City does. And if we are actually concerned about crime, what we need to do is get guns off of streets. And because Jim Jordan and the Republican Party does not want to address the crisis that is gun violence in America, they want to engage in a pursuit of political intimidation on the people who actually do want to hold people accountable.
In the midterms, House Republicans primarily, they ran on the economy, inflation, but since they gained the majority, their focus has been primarily on investigations, stoking culture wars. Like this week, they passed a transgender sports ban in schools. One, what do you think of that? But also, how would you describe their vision?
Well, the reason Republicans are so focused on these culture wars and they're so fixated on trans Americans and LGBT Americans, and they're fixated on what women do with their bodies is because they do not have a plan to improve the lives of working people across the country. They just don't. We haven't heard a single hearing or an idea that would fundamentally make people's material lives better. They have no plan on health care. They have no plan on our economy. And in order to distract from their lack of preparation and their lack of vision, they are trying to attack some of the most vulnerable Americans in this country.
Now, Speaker McCarthy, in order to become Speaker, had to cut some deals we still don't know the details on. Do you think he's actually running his caucus, or do you think someone else is?
He's not. I don't.
Who's running it?
I think you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene running the caucus. I mean, and she makes very common public statements to that effect. Every time something irks her, she communicates that McCarthy is doing her bidding. And I think that this is something that is quite clear. I think that Speaker McCarthy is stuck between having to please the most racist and heinous elements of his party with having to maintain a majority, and he is choosing to side with the extremists.
Do you worry he'll have the votes to pass his debt limit proposal?
I don't. And I think that that's actually the political situation that we're in right now, is that he's kind of brought himself up a creek without a paddle.
So we're here at SUNY Maritime in the Bronx, a beautiful place, by the way.
It's gorgeous.
Where they are breaking ground on an offshore wind workforce development program, something you secured funding for. You have an enormous platform. Of course, you have since you were elected. Why is the climate crisis an issue you've spent so much political capital on?
Well, you know, I think up until now, up until very recently, it's been very difficult to generate political momentum around addressing climate change, especially on the scale that we need to be addressing it on. And there are so many issues that are so critically important, and we're very lucky to have very strong political coalitions. But I know that when I was running, this was something that was just beginning to emerge, that same kind of political force and saliency around addressing the climate crisis. And so now it continues to be a really important priority, not just for me, but I think for many policymakers, because we also have to handle this in a way that actually addresses the injustices that working class people and communities of color have faced in the climate crisis as well.
You just reintroduced the Green New Deal. When you talk about big, expensive programs, that's where you sometimes hit resistance, I think. How do you convince those people who believe climate change is real, it is a crisis, but they're concerned that some of these proposed solutions are too grand or too expensive?
Yes, well, you know, I think it is important to acknowledge that the scale and the scope of what we are proposing is massive, but the scale and the scope of the climate crisis is even bigger. And if we are not proactive about very aggressively and transformationally addressing our infrastructure, our workforce, our preparation for the climate crisis, then the costs of not addressing it are going to be far greater.
Thank you to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for spending some time with me in her district this week. We're going to show you what she said about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis a little later in the show. But first, my take on